This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Actually traded an amp in this week, and it made me kind of think about the sheer amount of amps that have gone through my bedroom over the years. And I wanted to sort of kind of do a video just talking about things that I've tried, things that I've sold. And for me, I almost always buy amps second hand, and so basically this has been free money that I've used here in a way, because none of it really costed me any money long term, because I just sold them for about what I paid for them. So it's going to seem like an insane amount of gear, and it is, especially if you thought about having it all in one room at the same time. Now there are people that do have a ton of amps, like there's a Chris Buck video where he gets all his amps in one room, and there's a guy, it's John Simmons I think, isn't it, who's got a ton of amps. He's Sonic Drive Studios. I'm not a person that, I've kind of made the decision a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that I didn't really want to be a collector of gear for the sake of it anymore. And so I'm now down to 2 tube amps, and we'll talk about that more. So the very first amp that I ever had was a Park practice amp, Park by Marshall, tiny little 20 watt thing. When I started gigging, I used to have a band with my brother, and I used to play in church a bit as well. I bought a Crate GX65. Now this is a 2-channel amp. It's got a reverb on it as well. I think it might have been a spring reverb, because when you smacked it, it would make real noise. It was a solid state amp, but with a spring reverb. Then I upgraded to a Marshall AVT 150. If you don't remember these are the amps that had 4 channels, one of which was an acoustic sim. The other one was a clean, and then you had 2 drive channels and a ton of effects that you could select, and a foot switch that you could foot switch all this stuff with. I used that amp for quite a while. Not sure I ever really loved it, but that was sort of my childhood after the other 2. Then I think my first proper amp that I ever bought was this Mesa Boogie Nomad 45 that I still have behind me. I paid £750 for this from Manson's, which is the local guitar shop that Matt Bellamy and a few other people were involved with. This is the amp that I've gigged the most, and yeah, I've decided more or less that this is the amp that does closest to the things that I'd want in one amp anyway. So the whole rest of this list is going to be a pointless exercise, but it is what it is. At some point At some point I bought a Vox AC30. I can't remember if it had the blue speakers or not. I think it might have. I think I would have probably been looking for an Alnico blue version. It would have been one of the Chinese bunch. So I used to use that in a sort of dual setup with the Mesa and that in my bedroom. But I found that it created a ground loop when I connected the two up. So I think I didn't use it for very long and probably just sold it for, because I didn't use it much. I think I used to use it at home. Of course, an AC30 at home is really loud. It's quite cool for clean tones, but that's about it at home volumes. I then bought the Mesa Boogie Electrodyne, which you might have seen on this channel. I bought that from eBay and then later found out it was the amp that Tony Mackenzie had reviewed and stuff. Really enjoyed that amp for many years, and I think it looked amazing, probably the best looking amp I ever had. But I sold it recently because I've just had a kid and I decided I don't need all these things. I think then we could talk about the Mesa Boogie era. Mesa Boogie has been the brand I'm most interested in, I think, because in the teen era I was sort of listening to and playing a lot of John Petrucci. Obviously he's known for using Mesa Boogie amps. So over the years I've had 2 Blue Angels. I don't have them anymore. I've had 2 Mark IIIs. I've had a California Tweed. I've had a Mesa Boogie Fillmore. I've had a Mesa Boogie Mark 525 twice. Obviously, the ones that I've had more than once, I made a decision to sell one and then kind of regretted it and then bought one back and then sold it again. Mesa Boogie Lone Star I've had 3 times, and I think that is the one amp in this list, or there are a couple actually, that I might consider buying again. Mesa Boogie Mark 1 reissue and a Mesa Boogie Road King. I think that's all of the Mesa Boogies that I've ever had. So that's 15 Mesa Boogies, so that's enough to, I don't know, kill a horse if you threw him at a horse. Over time, I've kind of got to realise that, I don't know, there's not that much variation between amps in general, and particularly if you go for just one brand, you're not really answering any problems. I think this was really just part of my collecting kind of thing. I didn't own all of these at the same time, of course. This is over the course of many years. Some of them I bought kind of to demo, like the Road King. I thought, I've never tried a dual rectifier, let's try one. But in general, I think I don't really regret selling any of them. If I wanted a Mark amp, I could probably find one fairly easily still. But I think the Mesa Boogie Nomad for me is a little bit more usable at home as well. Yeah, it's whatever. I think I was kind of just buying into the idea of the Mesa Boogie. Oop, I just took delivery of an amp. Just kidding. Anyway, then I guess there's this experimental phase that I would talk about. So I've had things like, there was this Ibanez Tube Screamer amp, which was like a clean amp, about 20 watts that you could, it had a Tube Screamer built in. That was quite fun for a bit. I had an Ibanez Whole Tone, which was like the Ibanez version of the Polytone. I used to use that for a bit of jazz. Quite a cool amp, but it developed a problem and it was massive and heavy. A Line 6 Spider V, or Spider 5, 60 watt, probably my favorite ever amp. A Marshall Origin 20, those are really cool for the money actually. Very loud at home, no built-in reverb. A Marshall Blues Breaker, so the JTM 45 kind of combo. That was insanely loud for home use. I bought a attenuator, but the Fryette power station to use with it. It ended up just being like an expensive, heavy thing, and I thought, you know what, I don't need this. An Orange Rockaverb, I bought that because I really liked some of the tones that I could get out of the Helix, and I thought, well, let's see what this is like in real life. An interesting amp, not something that I would use going forward. A Vox AC15, I bought that to just kind of, I don't know, see if there was something I was missing, and I'd never really owned a Vox amp, you know, recently, so I wanted to kind of play around with that. Turned out, I think, for me, they're a little bit noisy in this house. And again, one of those things where you've got quite a loud sounding amp that isn't necessarily hugely versatile. A Cornford Carrera, which could kind of do those Marshall tones at sensible-ish volumes, but again, it was just an experiment for some videos and stuff, and I thought, I don't really need this. I bought a PRS Sonzera new. It was like a discounted, but it turned out it had already been used, and I thought it sounded awful, so I sent that straight back. I bought a Fender Princeton recording amp because I thought that was a fairly cool idea. But when it arrived, the knob was broken, so that went back. I still think that's a pretty cool idea. It's a Fender Princeton with a Tube Screamer built in and a recording output. It sounded pretty cool. I've owned a Fender Princeton for a tiny bit. I thought that was a really cool sounding amp, but again, just a clean thing for home, not terribly useful. I had a Fender Champ, the oldest amp that I've ever owned, second oldest. A Boss Katana, Don't need to say too much about that. A Line 6 Catalyst. I think that, again, the Catalyst and Katana did make me reconsider some of this amp stuff, because I've been in the room with like a Vibreverb, a Soldano Slow, and I didn't really feel like I was missing out when I was playing the Catalyst. It was just as fun to play, it sounded just as much like an amp. So it's a weird thing to say, but it kind of made me think like maybe, you know, you don't need to have a million tube amps. Maybe one or two might be enough. And then the other kind of little thing, aside from like the Mesa Boogie era, there's also been this kind of interest in the Dumble thing for me. And so that started with a Fuchs 4 Aces. And this might be one of the amps that I really, if I could buy one again, I probably would. Because I think that was quite an interesting little amp. Really, really loud for 4 watts. Sounded really cool though. I've also had a Fuchs Blackjack 21 for a tiny bit. I didn't keep that for very long. A Keriotone ODS 50, which my buddy Jake had for a bit, and then we moved that one on as well. Trying to get that Dumble idea, but for home use, those things have generally been a little bit too loud, to be quite honest with you. And then that kind of Dumble thing, also the Two Rock Jet 35, I tried that for a tiny bit, gigged it once, and thought this doesn't actually do anything particularly that I couldn't do with a Mesa Boogie amp. So the very last amp that I bought, I believe, is the Fender Pro Reverb. I bought that off of Jake, who bought it off of David Gilmour's Tech. That needs to go for a service. So that is my amp journey. And I can honestly say now that my gas for amps has never been less, if that's the phrase. That probably is a phrase, isn't it? I got to the point where I've tried so many amps and still come back to the one that I bought when I was like 16 or whatever, and think, well, that sounds as good as anything I've tried through that entire journey. To the point where, I don't know, you could shake something in my face and I'd probably say, interesting. There's a couple of things that I would be interested in, again, like the Fuchs 4 Aces thing. Maybe I might try that down the road, maybe, but I'm not sure that I definitely need to. And I'm quite enjoying having this kind of space behind me. I think this is one of the things that I kind of missed in my old house as well, was that I was just filling up spaces for whatever reason. And I'm now kind of getting to the point where it's like, well, actually headspace and being able to like see the floor in a room is quite valuable as well. I've never been particularly wealthy throughout all of this amp buying thing as well, probably because I bought so many amps. So this is like, I don't drink or don't really go on holiday, these sorts of things. It's just, this was kind of like a bit of a hobby over the years. It's over the course of, you know, I bought this when I was, what, 16, I'm now 33. So we're talking about like sort of over 15 years or whatever. So not necessarily as insane as it looks all on paper, but it has made me think. I've put comparisons up and done comparisons of bits and pieces, and it's like, well, I do still sound pretty much the same on each amp, and I do try to dial in pretty much a similar sounding thing. It gets to the point where you start to find what sort of sounds you like, and it happens that the Nomad 45 does them as good as anything else. So it's been a bit of a weird one. Things that would still interest me, I think, Dumble type stuff. As well, I was interested in the PRS Hendrix 20, because apparently Eric Johnson is using that at the moment. I was considering demoing that. Let me know in the comments if you've tried one of those. Yeah, that sort of thing maybe. But I think in general, I'm finding that having the space is more beneficial. It is really different playing a tube amp to playing a modeler, like an amp in the room thing when you're playing. People will tell you that it's a thing that like people are looking for, that they're like weirdos that are missing out on something. The amp in the room thing is definitely a different thing to playing with a modeler. And if you switch between the two, you can get a sense for this. I think if you're really used to playing with an amp in the room, it's very different. So I do still think that having one or two amps, you know, if you can afford them, if you can afford as many as you like, then whatever, do whatever makes you happy. But I think for me, what I decided was having just one or two options was better than filling up a room with 10 things that were just taking up loads of space. So that's, I think, every amp that I've ever owned. Oh, I've got like a Matchless Lightning clone here made by Rift that I need to get housed, but that will maybe appear on the channel at some point. I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers for now.